I've been into platformer games ever since I was a little kid, and God only knows the amount of time I put into Super Mario 64 and Odyssey when I was younger. But while I appreciate mustached Italian plumbers as much as the next guy, I also used to play the heck out of the Sonic games. Up there with iconic characters Gex and Bubsy in terms of critical acclaim, Sonic has appeared in a million and one different genres, and as I wanted to make a video about him, I've decided to cover the 1996 fighting game Sonic the Fighters. This game is legendary for being jank, and as I've only played it once or twice, I wanted to sit down, properly try and learn it, and make a video covering my thoughts. Sonic the Fighters is known all across the internet for being very weird, but I think that the idea behind the game has a lot of potential. Sonic Mania, no not you, was big in the 90s, and as the series has lots of colourful characters that all look and act differently, putting them all into a fighting game makes way too much sense, and not to mention, this game was made by Sega AM2. You know, the iconic palm tree people who created Virtua Fighter, Daytona USA, and Outrun 2, which I personally consider to be the best ever arcade racing game. Sonic the Fighters should have been a slam dunk, but it's never had a really good reception, and as I don't know much about the game, I wanted to learn why, so join me on my journey as I explore Sonic the Fighters in detail. The idea for Sonic the Fighters came from the legend himself, Yu Suzuki, after he saw a programmer on Fighting Vipers playing around with a Sonic the Hedgehog model that had been placed into the game for a bit of a laugh. After deciding that an arcade fighting game based on Sonic was a good idea, Suzuki pitched it to Hiroshi Kataoka, another higher up within AM2. Luckily for Suzuki, Kataoka also liked the idea, but before development could begin, he had to get permission from Sonic Team first. Sonic Team was in charge of licensing out anything Sonic related to others, so in order to get the ball rolling, game designer and insider trading enthusiast Yuji Naka had to sign off on the project. At first, Yuji Naka couldn't see Sonic and his friends fitting into a fighting game, but after seeing the work that the game's animators had completed, he was convinced that the project would be a success. I just couldn't think of Sonic as a fighting game. I was worried about whether he could really fight, considering his large head and short arms. I was amazed at how smoothly Sonic moved. We were delighted. The animation is superb, matching Fighting Vipers and Virtua Fighter 2, but this time, with the action firmly based in the realms of fantasy, AM2 can really let their imagination run riot. After the initial growing pains had been sorting out, Sega AM2 began full development on the game, with Sonic Team giving them advice on how to properly portray characters and stages from the Sonic IP. Sonic the Fighters also runs on the Sega Model 2 arcade board and the Fighting Vipers engine, so it plays sorta similarly to that game. Believe it or not, but Sonic the Fighters marked the first time that Sonic was properly modelled in 3D. As a result, the developers had to figure out how to properly model him for the very first time, and to assist with this process, Yuji Naka gave Hiroshi Kataoka a figurine of Sonic for the development team to reference. Speaking of character modeling, the developers knew that in order to make the game stand out in arcades, they had to make the characters' 3D models instantly recognizable, so they tried to make their faces look as close as possible to their 2D counterparts. When it comes to the gameplay, however, Sonic Fighters was made for a casual audience, so it lacks big combos and technical movement. The barrier system was added to make it clear when characters were blocking, and the rings that drop when you get hit are meant to indicate to casuals that their character is taking damage, while also being a fun reference to the mainline Sonic games. Each time a fighter takes damage, rings are sent flying from their body all over the arena, and the health bar moves down a notch or two. The reason AM2 introduced this idea is because they felt it would make it easier for beginners to judge what kind of kicking they're taking, rather than past glances at the health bar every few seconds. While most of the characters had appeared in previous Sonic games, newcomers Bean the Dynamite and Bark the Polar Bear were created specifically for Sonic the Fighters, and the character Honey from Fighting Vipers was found in the game files by hackers years after the game was released. She's modelled like a cat, and in an interview, Kataoka explained that he believes that Honey's character designer on Fighting Vipers slipped her into the game as a little secret. An interesting part about the game's history, however, concerns the non-existent Sega Saturn port, although at one point in time this was planned to be a real thing. Right as the game was announced, a magazine in the UK called Computer and Video Games immediately published an article about the game, and towards the bottom of the page they write, as you can see, Saturn conversion starts in 2 months. It was speculated throughout the industry that late 1996 was the most realistic potential release window for this Sega Saturn port. Lending itself to this theory was a report from a Squaresoft representative who attended E3 1996, and he explained to members of the press that he was shown a private demonstration of the Sega Saturn hardware, which also included a version of Sonic the Fighters running natively on the console. In a 1997 issue of Computer and Video Games magazine, which I mentioned before, they listed a rumor about the game, saying that it was set to release in summer in Japan on the Saturn, with the US Saturn release coming a few months after. In the end, a Sega Saturn port of Sonic the Fighters never came to fruition, and Yojiro Ogawa of Sonic Team said in a retrospective about the game that Sega decided to not port the game to the Saturn in the end because reproducing the arcade experience at home on the console was very difficult. Sonic the Fighters may look like a true 3D fighter, but it actually plays out on a 2D plane. The whole game is fully rendered in 3D, but you can't freely sidestep, so it's sort of like Tekken 1 in that regard. Speaking of Tekken 1, I think that Sonic the Fighters is just as clunky as that game, to be honest. You control your character by moving the stick, and there are 3 buttons: punch, kick, and barrier. The first 2 are obvious, but barrier refers to the game's defensive mechanic. Much like how you hold the block button down to defend from enemy attacks in games like Sonic Unleashed, the barrier in Sonic the Fighters is the origin of this mechanic in the Sonic series. What this means is that you don't hold back to block, instead you activate your barrier. However, the game gives you the ability to destroy your opponent's barrier if they rely on it too much, and if you want to use the barrier to go on the offense, you can use one of the 5 barriers given to you to enter Hyper Mode. Hyper Mode lets you perform longer combos and all new super moves that are only accessible when you're in this mode. You know, now that I think about it, since Sonic the Fighters released a few years before the first Guilty Gear, does that mean that Sonic the Fighters was the first fighting game to have an install? Look, if so, then I guess this game was ahead of its time in that regard. Moving on to the character roster, there are 8 playable characters to choose from, although you can play as characters like Metal Sonic and Dr. Eggman if you hack the game, but normally you only get these 8, and they all look and animate completely differently from each other. Sonic relies on punches and kicks, Amy uses a hammer, and Fang can use a gun, for example. AM2 did include some motion inputs into the game, however, so for example, if you want to perform Fang's Blind Fire special move, you have to do a half circle forward motion. With that being said, a good 99% of the game's moves can be performed by pressing buttons in a certain order, usually with a direction in there somewhere too, so the attack strings in Sonic the Fighters can be compared to those of Virtua Fighter. Combos are also very short and easy to pull off, and they generally don't do super huge damage or anything crazy like that. I'll also say that the game feels very stiff and rigid, especially by today's standards. Moving around and jumping can be a chore due to the outdated movement systems, and the closest comparison I can think of is vanilla Street Fighter 2, the version of the game that feels like you're fighting underwater. I know I said before that Sonic the Fighters mostly takes place on a 2D plane, however if you press a direction and all 3 buttons at the same time, you can sidestep. In my time with the game, I found that sidestepping to dodge enemy attacks was nearly useless due to the small distance you cover when you input a sidestep. Honestly, I found it much more effective to just go for a throw to break the enemy's defense as opposed to sidestepping to try and move around the enemy. There isn't much to say when speaking about the gameplay overall. The game is just too simplistic in nature to warrant an extensive discussion on how it functions, and I couldn't find anything crazy I wanted to share during my time with the game. Right from the get-go, Sonic the Fighters released to a pretty meh reception, I guess. Japanese gaming trade magazine Game Machine listed it as the 13th most popular arcade game in July of 1996, and reviewers over in the West, like Next Generation magazine for example, gave it very average reviews, writing that while Sonic fans would enjoy the game, fighting game fans would be turned off by its lack of depth and strategy, which was, and still is, a major complaint about the game. As mentioned before, Sonic the Fighters was made for a casual audience, but while fighting games try to balance accessibility with competitive depth, Sega AM2 focused way too hard in the casual direction, leaving genuine hardcore fighting game fans really disappointed. When the game was re-released in 2005 as part of the Sonic Gems collection, modern review outlets like IGN criticized it for its simplistic and dated gameplay, and I totally understand why, just to be honest. Hoping to strike gold with the game a third time, Sega released the game again on Xbox 360 and PS3 as a downloadable game in high definition. It currently sits at a 47 on Metacritic, making it one of the worst reviewed fighting games I've ever covered, with the UK's Xbox magazine describing it as a fossilized turd that never deserved to be excavated. Ouch. While I personally am not that harsh on the game, I understand why reviewers back in the 90s and onwards thought the game was alright, maybe? Sonic the Fighters is more of a casual party game rather than a proper fighter, which is very ironic, and this is reflected with its uncomplicated gameplay and lack of big combos and strategies. The game still looks quite nice in my opinion, and I've got to say that I love how colourful everything is, but aside from that, it's not amazing. While it's obvious by now that Sonic the Fighters was a rare misfire for Sega AM2, I still believe that a fighting game based on the Sonic IP makes way too much sense. If you like really jank, weird, and obscure fighting games, then I recommend checking this game out. You can easily emulate the PS3 version, which is how I played it, and it's also readily available on modern Xbox systems as a small digital download. I thought it was really cool seeing some of my favourite Sonic characters like Espio and Knuckles in the context of a fighting game, but the gameplay is too elementary, I'll say, for me to want to learn more of the game's mechanics and systems. It's fun to play with friends in short bursts if you can convince them to try it out, but if you pass up on the game, you're honestly not missing out on much. Before I go, I want you to remember the following quote. You either die a hero or you live long enough to become the villain.